Hey everyone, real quick, wanted to mention something up front before we get into the details of this episode. We have turned on the ability for listeners to be able to text us. So wherever you get your podcast, there should be at the top of the show notes a link that you can click now. And when you click that link, it'll directly bring you to your text messages where you can actually text us a question and we can receive that. So kind of exciting for us to get feedback from everyone, but it's also relevant for an episode like today where we're previewing the 7 habits. So if you have questions about the 7 habits, literally text us right now. So we're kind of excited to see what comes in with that.
Questions or criticisms.
Yes.
Feel free to text it all.
Yeah. Any feedback you have, we'd love to hear, but we're kind of excited about that to hear from you. So shoot us a text. So today's a book preview episode. We've done that before, but our outline for this episode is number 1, why this book? Number 2, a little about the author, and then the third is what questions do we want to ask, and what are some of the core concepts that stood out to us? So Britt, I'll ask you, why are we reviewing the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, especially since I reviewed this book when I first launched this podcast?
Yeah, well, I think I just put pressure on you. I could not, of all the books that I wanted to help review, this is, of course, at the top of my list because Stephen Covey is our grandpa and your namesake, right? So
that's right.
I couldn't go without wanting to talk about this book. It's had such an impact on my life and on the life of many of my friends. I knew my grandpa in a certain way when he was alive, and he passed a few years ago, and I feel like I've come to know him even differently through his work since he's passed. So I'm excited. I have to review this book.
Outside of the fact that he is our grandfather, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and this goes without saying, but it is probably the most well-known personal leadership book or self-help book on the market, or at least if not the most, it's usually in everyone's top 2 or 3. And one perspective I wanted to give, again, the reason why this book is Jim Collins. He wrote the book Good to Great. He's a tremendous thinker. He wrote the foreword to, I think it was the 25th or the 30th anniversary edition of the 7 Habits. And he had some really interesting things that I thought was kind of relevant to set the stage for the 7 Habits. So he actually sat down with our grandfather years ago and asked him this question. And I'm quoting here. How did you come up with the ideas in the 7 Habits? I didn't, he responded. What do you mean, I asked. You wrote the book. Yes, I wrote the book, but the principles were known long before me. He continued, they are more like natural laws. All I did was put them together to synthesize them for people. That's when I began to understand why this work had such an impact. Covey had spent more than 3 decades studying, practicing, teaching, and refining what he ultimately distilled into these pages. He did not seek credit for the principles. He sought to teach the principles, to make them accessible. He saw creating the 7 Habits not primarily as a means to his own success, but as an act of service. Growing up around Papa, I guess that I feel like that quote kind of embodies what his life was.
Yeah. Papa was so humble. You never, ever would have thought that you were around someone famous if you were around him. He was the kindest person ever, and it didn't matter who it was. It could be the least person in the world or the greatest person in the world. He would take the time for each person, and he really genuinely believed that he never took credit for the 7 Habits and these principles. He just said that he organized it in a way for people to understand. And I think that that's a really cool and genuine feeling from him, because it's not that common, I think, in these days. But he genuinely felt that way, that they weren't his habits, his principles, because they're not. They're timeless, and he just put them together so that we could understand them. And I think that takes a lot of humility to recognize that.
I've had this question myself, like, why did the 7 Habits have such a big impact? Why does it continue to sell copies like it does today, and it's continues to be very popular? Another kind of thing Jim Collins put together I thought was very well said around this idea. So I'll just read this as well from Jim Collins. He said, Stephen Covey was a master synthesizer. I think of what he did for personal effectiveness as analogous to what graphical user interface did for personal computers. Prior to Apple and Microsoft, few people could harness computers to their daily lives. There was no easily accessible user interface. There were no mouse, pointers, friendly icons, or overlapping windows on a screen, let alone a touch screen. But with the Macintosh and then Windows, the mass of people could finally tap into the power of the microchip behind the screen. Similarly, there had been hundreds of years of accumulated wisdom about personal effectiveness, from Benjamin Franklin to Peter Drucker, but it was never assembled into one coherent, user-friendly framework. Covey created a standard operating system, the Windows for personal effectiveness, and he made it easy to use. And again, that was by Jim Collins. I feel like that is such a good explanation and makes so much sense. And I think that was kind of the genius of our grandfather was the ability to synthesize and organize these true principles that, again, he did not invent, but put them in a framework that is easy to understand and apply in life.
Sure. Coming from someone who doesn't understand computers, I agree with that. And I think it's important that people remember my grandpa, or our grandpa, he didn't write this book until he was in his 50s. So he had decades of work, teaching, experience to see this and put it together. It's not like he came out and just came out with all of these things. I think he saw this in action firsthand, which is what kind of prompted him to organize these things.
The last thing I'll mention around why the book 7 Habits is actually an answer to a question that my grandfather gave. So one time he's asked this question frequently, because again, the book was published in 1989. And the question is, are the 7 habits still relevant today? And for that matter, are they going to be relevant 10 years from now, 20 years, 50, 100 years from now? And this was his answer. I'll say it word for word. He said, the greater the change and the more difficult our challenges, the more relevant the habits become. The reason, our problems and pain are universal and increasing, and the solutions to the problems have been and are always and will be based upon universal, timeless, self-evident principles common to every enduring, prospering society throughout history. I did not invent them and take no credit for them. I've simply identified and organized them into a sequential framework. So anyways, that's the reason why we're choosing 7 habits. Multiple reasons. Getting in a little bit about the author himself, our grandfather, just a brief story about his life. He grew up in Utah, and kind of the family business was actually running a hotel chain. If you've ever been to Salt Lake City before, you may have heard of the Little America Hotel. It's not part of our family anymore or anything, but when he grew up, that was kind of what his father was running, that hotel. But our grandfather had zero desire to be in that business. He just, I don't think he enjoyed it. And what he had a passion around was teaching and leadership development and kind of how organizations worked. So he went to his father, our great grandfather, and basically said, hey, I don't want to be in the business. Like, I have a passion for teaching. And to his dad's credit, he said, that's great. You need to pursue that. And if you're passionate about that and you feel a calling to that, that's what you need to do. But our grandfather became a university professor and taught in the business school in organizational behavior. And eventually, like Britt mentioned, in his late 40s, early 50s, he started doing more consulting work for companies and decided to leave teaching to basically start. Originally, it was called Stephen R. Covey and Associates. Then it was the Covey Leadership Center. And then now today, the company is called Franklin Covey. But pretty interesting for a professor to leave his profession of teaching in his 50s to write a book and kind of start a company. It's a pretty incredible story, what he did. And obviously, our grandfather, he's not with us anymore. He passed away in 2012. So the person we're going to have to talk through 7 Habits is actually our dad, Stephen M. R. Covey. He's been on the podcast before for his book, The Speed of Trust. But we felt talking to our dad about this, who was heavily involved with the 7 Habits when it was released and was actually the CEO of the company at the time, will be a good person to give us kind of unique insight around that.
Which, once again, if you guys have any questions that you'd like us to ask him, please send them in, because he will definitely have a unique perspective and experiences that I'm sure we wouldn't even think about, be prompted to ask him. So please send in your questions.
Obviously, anyone can kind of read about some of the things I've talked about, talking about our grandfather, but maybe Britt, share what was kind of your personal experience? You were a bit younger when he was still alive, but what do you remember about Papa?
Yeah, he passed away when I was 14, so I really knew him as Papa, as Grandpa, right? Not some leadership guru. Um, but I think what I loved most about him that not a lot of people know that read his things was he was a prankster, a jokester. He loved to break down the barriers of professionalism, and I think that's what made him so likable. I still remember I think I was in sixth grade or something, I bought a funny hat with long gray wig hair coming out of the back of it. And I wore it to his house, and he loved it so much. He took it from me, and he would wear it to his presentations. And if you know my grandpa, he was bald by the age of 25, right? But yeah, he wore this fake wig hair that he thought looked fun, and he would wear it to his presentations, to these professional events. I was that defines his jokester in him, and I think I got a little bit of that with me too. So I love that part of him.
I echo what Britt said, where growing up, I had no idea that he was this famous author and a lot of people knew him. I just knew him as Papa, and that he was really funny and silly and would wear these crazy masks around. And they actually, growing up at our grandparents' house, they had these pictures on the wall. And one of them was a picture of, they would make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on top of his bald head. And the story was that he would be like on a conference call with like a big corporation like an IBM or something, and having this really intense conversation with like their executive team. Meanwhile, like his kids were making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on top of his head, which I just thought's hilarious. I just remember him. He always, even though he's had a lot of kids, a lot of grandkids. Anytime he spent time with me, I always felt like I was the most important person in his life at that moment. And I remember my senior year in high school one time was just kind of stressed about the future. And, anyone that's about to graduate high school can be kind of a weird time. And I just called my grandpa up and asked if he could talk. And he spent half a day with me, just out of the blue, and realizing how busy he is and the people that he's meeting across the world. And the fact that he would just sit down with me, spend half a day. I look at it now, in hindsight, realizing like, wow, that's amazing that someone like him would take that time. And I just thought nothing of it, because I just knew that he loved me and cared about me and gave me that time and focus and attention. So absolutely love everything about Papa and the influence he's had in my life, and I know for Britt's life as well. Britt, what are some questions you want to ask Dad, kind of about Seven Habits? And again, I'll just remind the audience, if you have a question about the Seven Habits, or about the development of Seven Habits, or Stephen Covey himself, shoot us a text, and we'll actually be able to incorporate that when we do the interview with our dad on this. So just a reminder. But Britt, what questions do you want to explore when we talk through this?
I know he was asked about this multiple times, but it's something that I would be interested to hear Dad's perspective on it. Is what is either the most important habit of the seven, or what is the most difficult habit to live? If you can rank them at all, right? I think that's an interesting question that a lot of people have. And then one concept that I've really loved as I've gotten older, that I feel like is difficult to live, but so unique, and such a Papa concept, as I would call it, right? Is just the idea that he taught strengths lie in differences even more than similarities. And as someone who's married, I think that can be true, but it's also difficult, right? When you have differences in any relationship, professional, personal, just the idea of how can strengths lie in your differences even more than your similarities? And how do you handle that? How do you coexist and thrive together with your differences?
Love it. I think for me, I would like to ask some questions around the origins of the seven habits. And I know dad knows a lot more about this than either of us do about how it developed from the early years of him being a professor all the way until the book was released. I think there's some cool stories around that I've heard before, but I don't know intimately. So that's something I want to ask about. And then another thing I just want to explore more along the lines of the name of our podcast, Paradigm. And one of the things Papa always talked about was this idea of paradigms, and that the way you see the problem is the problem. And so I just want to have further understanding and discussion around our paradigms, how we see the world, and how can we change our paradigms? Because if you can change your paradigm, then your behavior and attitude automatically change. So those are some of the things I kind of want to ask about. But again, whatever questions you have for the listeners, please send them in, because we'll incorporate those into the interviews. Just so everyone's aware that the episode around the seven habits with our dad, we'll release that 3 weeks from now. Normally we won't have that big of a gap, but that gives us time for you to send in questions as well. So 3 weeks from now is when that episode will drop, and I just wanted to let everyone know that's kind of the time frame for when that happens. So anything else, Britt, you want to mention before we sign off?
No, I'm good. I'm excited. Hopefully people join us on this one. I think it's going to be great.
I do too. And again, we appreciate everyone's support. It's been fun to launch this with Britt. I'll just end again with something Jim Collins wrote that echoes how we feel. He said, "No person lasts forever, but books and ideas can endure. When you engage with these pages," talking about the seven habits, "you will be engaging with Stephen Covey at the peak of his powers. You can feel him reaching out from the text to say, 'Here, I really believe this. Let me help you. I want you to get this, to learn from it. I want you to grow, to be better, to contribute more, to make a life that matters. His life is done, but his work is not.'" And Britt and I like to think that we play a small part in continuing his work and the things that he taught. And so we're really grateful to have this opportunity to talk with our dad about the seven habits and about our grandfather. So thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you in 3 weeks from now.